Picture the world at its edge. Snow-laden peaks rise like frozen cathedrals, their summits lost in clouds that have never known the warmth of the sun. The wind here does not howl, it whispers. It carries no words, only the memory of silence older than language itself. Between these peaks, where the earth folds into secret geometries, there are places the maps have forgotten, places where time moves differently, where the air itself seems to hold its breath. The legend begins not with a location, but with a longing. For centuries, travelers have spoken of a valley hidden beyond the Himalayas, a sanctuary where the seasons never turn violent, where orchards bloom eternally, and where those who enter cease to age as the world does. They call it Shangri-La. The name itself sounds like wind through prayer flags, like water over ancient stone. It is a place that exists in the space between myth and memory, between the known world and the world we wish existed. The legend has many faces. To some, it is a monastery perched at impossible altitude, its walls painted with mandalas that seem to shift when observed. To others, it is a valley carpeted in wildflowers, encircled by peaks so high they pierce the boundary between earth and heaven. Always, there is the promise. Those who find it will discover not just peace, but eternal peace, a refuge from the relentless march of time. But here is the peculiar truth about Shangri-La. It has never been found, yet it has been found 1,000 times. Explorers return with photographs of serene valleys. Monks speak of hidden monasteries. Geographers mark coordinates that dissolve upon closer inspection. The valley appears in dreams more reliably than on any map. This is not a story about whether Shangri-La is real. This is a story about why we need it to be. As we journey through these chapters, we will walk the thin line between history and myth, between the documented and the dreamed. We will trace the footsteps of those who searched, examine the texts that describe it, and explore the science that suggests such a place might exist. We will discover that sometimes the most enduring truths are not found in what can be proven, but in what cannot be forgotten. The mist thickens around the peaks. Somewhere beyond it, perhaps, a valley waits. Let us begin. The Western world first learned the name Shangri-La in 1933, when British novelist James Hilton published Lost Horizon *. His protagonist, Conway, crashes an airplane in the Himalayas and stumbles upon a lamasery called Shangri-La, where time has been suspended and wisdom preserved against the coming darkness of the modern age. The book became an immediate sensation, so compelling was its vision that Shangri-La entered the English language as shorthand for any earthly paradise. But Hilton was not inventing from nothing. He was translating. Long before his novel, Tibetan and Bhutanese oral traditions spoke of *BEYU, L** hidden valleys revealed only in times of strife, sanctuaries preserved by spiritual forces. These were not fantasies, but geographical hopes, woven into the fabric of Buddhist cosmology. Monks carried texts describing valleys where the air itself was blessed, where meditation could extend life beyond normal limits, where the world outside could rage while peace remained unbroken within. Hilton's genius was recognizing that the West, exhausted by the First World War and approaching the abyss of the Second, hungered for exactly such a refuge. His Shangri-La was a mirror held up to a civilization that had begun to doubt its own progress. In his valley, technology was gentle, leadership was wise, and immortality was not a curse, but a gentle fading into timelessness. Meanwhile, Tibetan lamas told their own stories. They spoke of Shambhala, of Pimlico, of valleys that would reveal themselves only when the world had descended into chaos. These were not fictional devices, but spiritual maps, passed from teacher to student, coordinates written in the language of devotion rather than degrees and minutes. The two traditions, Western literary fantasy and Eastern spiritual geography, began to merge. Explorers setting out into the Himalayas carried both Hilton's novel and fragments of Tibetan prophecy. They searched with compasses in one hand and prayer wheels in the other, never quite certain whether they were explorers or pilgrims. What they found were glimpses. A valley in Yunnan where the season seemed impossibly mild. A monastery in Bhutan, accessible only 3 months of the year. Villages where old men claimed their grandfathers' grandfathers had lived to see 5 generations. Each discovery was both confirmation and disappointment. Yes, such places existed, but were they the asterisk place? Or merely echoes of it? The maps they drew were peculiar documents. Solid lines dissolved into dotted suggestions. Labels bore question marks. Whole regions were marked unexplored, or more intriguingly, forbiddens. The map became a palimpsest of longing, each expedition adding another layer of possibility without ever achieving certainty. Hilton had drawn his map in dreams, but those dreams were sourced from something older. As we trace backward from his novel toward the traditions that inspired it, we discover that Shangri-La was never invented. It was remembered asterisk. The 19th century was an age of filling in blanks. The great empires sent their cartographers to the edges of the known world with instructions to measure, catalog, and claim. Mountains were triangulated, rivers traced to their sources, territories shaded in with the colors of conquest. The map became the empire's most powerful tool. To name a place was to own it. But the Himalayas resisted. Here, elevation made instruments unreliable. Magnetic compasses spun uselessly near iron-rich formations. Weather closed passes for 9 months of the year. Local guides, protecting sacred sites, sometimes led expeditions in carefully planned circles. And so, even as maps of Africa and the Arctic filled with confident lines and labels, the maps of the Tibetan Plateau and the mountain ranges surrounding it remained stubbornly incomplete. In 1864, British surveyor Thomas Montgomery began training local Indians dubbed pundits to secretly map Tibet and Nepal. These men, often disguised as pilgrims, measured distances by counting their steps with modified prayer beads, recorded altitudes by boiling water at different elevations, and memorized geographical features to transcribe later. They returned with extraordinary intelligence, but also with stories. Tales of valleys that appeared on no map, monasteries that seemed to move, passes that opened and closed according to no visible pattern. The blank spaces on their maps grew more suggestive. In 1889, a British expedition reported a vast unexplored region in eastern Tibet, a white space where rivers disappeared into mountain folds and emerged miles away with no apparent connection. The region was marked unsurveyed and left that way for decades. Into that white space, imagination poured. Russian explorer Nicholas Roerich, traveling through Central Asia in the 1920s, became convinced that somewhere in the Himalayas lay a valley preserving ancient wisdom. He studied Tibetan texts, interviewed lamas, and followed leads that seemed to evaporate like morning mist. His journals describe arriving at coordinates that should have revealed wonders, only to find ordinary rock and ice. And yet, he never quite abandoned the search. Something in the testimony of the locals, their certainty, their details suggested that the valley existed in a way maps could not capture. Perhaps most intriguingly, some expeditions reported finding valleys that had been mapped, but in the wrong locations. A pass marked 30 miles east appeared 30 miles west. A river shown flowing north ran south. It was as if the mountains themselves were reshuffling, or as if the early cartographers had deliberately introduced errors to protect what they had found. By the early 20th century, the Himalayas had become a landscape of both precision and mystery. Surveyors could calculate the height of Everest to within feet, yet could not agree on whether certain valleys existed at all. The map had become a kind of riddle each answer, revealing new questions, each blank space whispering possibilities. The valley that wasn't there had become more real than many that were. Centuries before Shangri-La entered Western consciousness, Buddhist texts described Shambhala, a kingdom hidden beyond the Himalayas, accessible only to those of pure heart and extraordinary karma. It was not merely a physical location, but a spiritual axis, a place where enlightenment could be approached more directly, where the Dharma burned with original intensity. The earliest detailed reference appears in the asterisk Kalachakra Tantra asterisk, composed sometime between the 10th and 11th centuries. Its capital, Kalapa, gleamed with palaces of crystal and gold. Its rulers, the Kulika kings, possessed both spiritual wisdom and temporal power, guiding their people toward collective enlightenment while preparing for a prophesied final battle between wisdom and ignorance. But the asterisk Kalachakra Tantra asterisk offers no simple directions. Its geographical descriptions are laced with symbolism, peaks named after virtues, rivers representing stages of realization, distances measured in spiritual rather than physical terms. A journey of 7 days might mean 7 years, or 7 lifetimes, or 7 stages of meditation. The map is encoded for those who can read beyond literal meaning. This has not stopped people from trying to locate it geographically. Tibetan scholars have placed Shambhala variously in the Tarim Basin, in the valleys north of Kashmir, in regions of what is now Tajikistan or Afghanistan. Some suggest it lies not horizontally distant, but vertically, that Shambhala exists at a different vibrational frequency, occupying the same space as our world, but inaccessible to ordinary perception. The Dalai Lama, when asked about Shambhala's location, has responded with characteristic nuance. It is both a real place and inner state. Perhaps it once existed physically, and now persists only spiritually. Or perhaps it remains hidden, revealed only when the world's darkness reaches a critical threshold, fulfilling its role as a refuge for the Dharma. What is striking about Shambhala is its persistence. Unlike most mythical kingdoms, Atlantis, El Dorado, Lemuria, Shambhala never faded into quaint fantasy. It remained a living belief, woven into ritual practice, invoked in prayers, described in texts copied and recopied across centuries. Pilgrims still set out to find it. Lamas still teach that it awaits. And there is this curious fact. Many Tibetan texts ascribe not one, but multiple hidden lands. Shambhala is the most famous, but there are others: Pemako, Kambalung, Bayul Drimojong. Each is said to be hidden by protective geography and spiritual seals, accessible only during specific times or to specific individuals. These are not random fantasies, but a systematic cosmology of refuge, a network of sanctuaries woven into the very fabric of the mountains. When James Hilton wrote * Lost Horizon *, he was tapping into this older, deeper current. Shangri-La is Shambhala translated into English, secularized for a Western audience, but carrying the same essential promise. Somewhere beyond the edge of the known world, peace endures. The echoes are unmistakable. Whether one calls it Shambhala or Shangri-La, whether one reads it as geography or metaphor, the vision persists: a valley where time moves gently, where wisdom is preserved, where the world's chaos cannot penetrate. Imagine the air at 14,000 feet. It is thin, sharp, tasting of stone and snow. Every breath requires intention. Sound carries strangely here. A voice can echo from cliff faces miles away, arriving seconds after the lips have closed. In this rarefied atmosphere, silence itself becomes palpable, a presence rather than an absence. The monasteries cling to mountainsides like birds' nests, stone and timber structures that seem to grow from the rock itself. Some are accessible only by rope ladders that can be drawn up, cutting off the world below. Others require pilgrimages of days or weeks, through passes that test both body and resolve. Inside these structures, monks have lived for centuries in rhythms unchanged, rising before dawn, chanting sutras that reverberate through wooden halls, meditating in cells barely large enough to sit cross-legged. Hemi's monastery in Ladakh, founded in 1630, houses one of the largest libraries of Buddhist texts outside Lhasa. Its halls smell of butter lamps and ancient paper. Monks move through the shadows in maroon robes, their footsteps soft on worn stone. They speak of texts in the archives that describe hidden valleys, prophecies of refuges, maps drawn in symbolic language. When asked directly about Shangri-La or Shambhala, they often smile the smile of those who know that some questions answer themselves in time. Tashil Han Po Monastery, seat of the Pangchon Lama, sits at the edge of Shigatse, commanding views of the Brahmaputra Valley. Here, in the early 20th century, explorers and spies came seeking information about the lands beyond Tibet's borders. The monks were courteous, hospitable, and utterly opaque. They confirmed nothing and denied nothing. When shown maps with blank spaces, they gazed at them with expressions that suggested the maps were incomplete in ways the cartographers did not understand. There are stories, whispered rather than proclaimed, of deeper archives caves behind the monasteries, tunnels extending into the mountain itself, where the oldest and most sacred texts are kept. These are not open to outsiders, sometimes not even to ordinary monks. What knowledge they contain remains a matter of speculation. Some believe they hold detailed instructions for reaching the hidden valleys. Others think they contain prophecies about when and how such valleys will be revealed. Still others suggest the texts describe places that no longer exist in our current world, remnants of an earlier age, preserved in writing if not in stone. The monks themselves embody a kind of living Shangri-La. They have chosen withdrawal from the world's urgencies, cultivated serenity as a practice, and organized their lives around timelessness rather than progress. In their routines, the same prayers at the same hours, the same rituals repeated for generations, time becomes circular rather than linear. Past and future collapse into an eternal present. When the sun sets behind the peaks and the first stars emerge in skies unpolluted by electric light, the monasteries begin their evening chants. The sound drifts across valleys, human voices merging with the wind, creating a sonic landscape that seems older than humanity itself. In these moments, the distinction between the monastery and Shangri-La becomes difficult to maintain. Perhaps these places are the hidden valleys, hidden not by geography, but by the simple fact that most of the world has forgotten how to be still. The monks continue their practices, indifferent to whether the world believes in Shangri-La. They have already found what they seek. The rest of us are still searching. In 1922, Joseph Rock arrived in the Yunnan province of southwestern China, carrying cameras, botanical equipment, and a restless determination to document what he called the last hidden places of Asia. He was an unlikely explorer, a self-taught botanist, a loner, a man driven as much by a need to escape Western civilization as by scientific curiosity. What he discovered in the valleys between Yunnan and Tibet would shape the imagination of the world. Rock's base was the town of Lijiang, nestled in the shadow of Jade Dragon Snow Mountain. From there, he launched expeditions into the surrounding highlands, territories where ethnic minorities, Naxi, Yi, Tibetan had lived for centuries in isolation from Han Chinese authority. The landscape was staggering. Gorges carved by the Yangtze and Mekong rivers, forests of rhododendron the size of oak trees, alpine meadows where yaks grazed beneath glaciers. His journals describe a world almost untouched by modernity. Villages accessible only by foot, where locals spoke languages unwritten and possibly unknown beyond their valleys. Monasteries perched on cliffs, their libraries filled with texts and scripts Rock could not decipher. He photographed everything: the architecture, the costumes, the faces of shamans and lamas, the peaks that rose like frozen flames into impossible heights. But it was a particular valley that captivated him most. In 1924, he traveled to the region of Muli, a semi-independent Tibetan Buddhist kingdom ruled by a Lama king. The journey required weeks of travel through terrain where the trails were often no wider than a foot. carved into cliff faces hundreds of feet above churning rivers. When he finally arrived, he found a landscape that seemed to exist outside time. The valley was temperate despite its altitude, sheltered by peaks that blocked the worst of the Himalayan weather. Orchards of apples and walnuts grew beside barley fields. The monastery at Muli governed with a light touch, collecting taxes, but otherwise allowing the villages to function according to their own rhythms. Rock described it as a place where the world's troubles seemed not to exist, where the concerns of politics and commerce faded into irrelevance. He stayed for months, photographing, cataloging, and writing letters to academic journals and magazines. His articles, published in National Geographic *, featured images of staggering beauty monks in ritual dress, mountain vistas that seemed to touch the sky, villagers whose faces suggested a contentment the West had lost. The photographs circulated widely, capturing imaginations. Among those who read Rock's accounts was James Hilton, then working on a novel about a hidden valley in the Himalayas. Hilton never acknowledged Rock directly, but the parallels are unmistakable. The geography, the isolated lamasery, the sense of a world preserved, these are Rock's Muli, translated into fiction. Shangri-La, in other words, was not invented from whole cloth, but inspired by a real place, documented by a real explorer, and then mythologized for a global audience. Rock himself never claimed to have found Shangri-La. He was a scientist, and his reports focused on botany, ethnography, and geography. But his photographs and writings carried an undercurrent of wonder, a sense that he had glimpsed something precious and fragile, something the modern world would soon overwhelm. He was right. By the 1950s, Muli had been absorbed into the People's Republic of China. The Lama King was deposed, the monasteries secularized, the valleys opened to development. Rock's photographs became historical documents, evidence of a world that had existed and then ceased to exist, or at least ceased to exist in the form he had found it. Yet the images remain. In them, we see what Shangri-La might have looked like if it were real. Or perhaps we see what it did look like before the world found it. In the year 2001, a small town in Yunnan province made an extraordinary decision. It would change its name. The town, historically known as Zhongdian, was a modest place, a high-altitude settlement of roughly 50,000 people, primarily ethnic Tibetan, surviving on barley farming, yak herding, and a trickle of adventurous tourists. It was beautiful but poor, isolated but not unique. Dozens of similar towns dotted the Tibetan plateau, but Zhongdian had a theory. Local officials and scholars, studying Joseph Rock's accounts and comparing them with the geography described in Lost Horizon *, became convinced that their valley was the inspiration for Shangri-La. The evidence was circumstantial but suggestive. The altitude matched, the surrounding peaks resembled Hilton's descriptions, and Rock had spent significant time in the region. If they could convince the world that Zhongdian * was Shangri-La, tourists would come, and with them, prosperity. The campaign was meticulous. Researchers published papers arguing their case. Tourism agencies created marketing materials. And in 2001, with provincial approval, Zhongdian officially became Shangri-La County. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Within a few years, tourist arrivals increased tenfold. Hotels were built, airports expanded, infrastructure modernized. The town that had been a quiet backwater became an international destination. Visitors arrived with copies of Hilton's novel, comparing passages to the landscape, taking photographs beneath signs that read, "Welcome to Shangri-La." But something strange happened in the translation. The name change, meant to capitalize on the myth, began to transform the reality. Old Tibetan neighborhoods were renovated to look more Shangri-La-like, which in practice meant more how tourists imagined Shangri-La should look. Traditional architecture was sometimes bulldozed, and replaced with constructed ancient streetscapes. Monasteries that had survived for centuries found themselves surrounded by souvenir shops and karaoke bars. The irony was noted by more than one observer. In becoming Shangri-La, the place had ceased to resemble it. The tranquility and isolation that defined the myth were precisely what the name change destroyed. The valley that had remained partially hidden for centuries was now on tour bus itineraries, its serenity exchanged for economic development. And yet, the tourists kept coming. For many, the name was enough. To stand in a place officially designated as Shangri-La, even if that place bore signs of modernity, satisfied something deep. They could return home and say they had been there, that Shangri-La was real, that they had seen it. The myth did not need to match reality. It only needed a location where belief could be performed. Other places took notice. Regions in Nepal, Bhutan, northern India, even Pakistan began making similar claims. Each had geographical arguments. Each could point to local legends. Each could cite explorers' journals. The search for Shangri-La became a competition with multiple claimants and no impartial judge. In 2014, a fire swept through Shangri-La County's old town, destroying much of the historic Tibetan quarter. The government rebuilt it more beautiful, more tourist-friendly, less authentic. The new old town gleamed with fresh timber and polished stone. It looked exactly like what a movie set of Shangri-La might look like. And perhaps that is the ultimate odd fact, that Shangri-La, born as fiction, inspired by reality, and then claimed by reality, has become a kind of fiction again, a place that exists because people decided it should exist, regardless of whether it resembles the myth that inspired it. The line between real and imagined has dissolved. The map and the territory have become indistinguishable. Somewhere, one imagines, the original valley, if it ever existed, watches silently, still hidden. Maps, we tell ourselves, are objective documents. Lines represent borders. Colors indicate elevations. Labels name the named. But the history of Himalayan cartography tells a different story, one in which maps are as much political instruments and imaginative canvases as they are representations of terrain. Consider the maps produced by the British Survey of India in the 19th century. These were technical marvels, the result of decades of triangulation, measurement, and calculation. They showed the Himalayas with unprecedented accuracy, identifying peaks, passes, rivers, and settlements. And yet, embedded within their precision were curious gaps. Regions marked unsurveyed, valleys shown with dotted lines, indicating uncertainty, rivers that appeared and disappeared, mountains whose positions seemed to shift between different editions of the same map. Some of these gaps were practical territories too remote, too politically sensitive, or too dangerous to survey, but others were deliberate. Colonial authorities sometimes obscured the locations of strategic passes, fearing that rival empires might use the information. Certain sacred sites were omitted at the request of local rulers, who had no wish to see pilgrimage routes become invasion routes. And in some cases, surveyor spies, working undercover in forbidden territories, may have introduced intentional errors to protect the sources of their intelligence. Tibetan maps operated under entirely different principles. Traditional Tibetan cartography was not concerned with scale or accurate positioning. A monastery might be drawn larger than the mountain it sat upon, because spiritual significance trumped physical size. Distances were sometimes measured in days of travel rather than miles, and those days varied depending on the traveler's spiritual preparation. A journey that took a monk 3 days might take a merchant 2 weeks, not because their walking speeds differed, but because the landscape itself responded differently to different intentions. These maps often included Bayul, the hidden valleys marked with symbolic notation. A small drawing of a lotus might indicate a valley that would be revealed in future times of trouble. A specific color of ink might signal that the location was protected by spiritual guardians. To the uninitiated, these maps appeared vague and unreliable. To those trained in their reading, they were precise instructions encoded in a language of devotion. When Western explorers began comparing Tibetan maps with their own surveys, the results were confounding. Features appeared in wildly different locations. Whole regions present on Tibetan maps seemed to have no physical counterpart. And yet, guides using those Tibetan maps successfully navigated terrain that defeated Westerners with their compasses and theodolites. The Tibetan maps were not inaccurate. They were answering different questions. Russian explorer Nicholas Roerich, who traveled extensively through Central Asia in the 1920s, collected dozens of local maps in his search for Shambhala. He noticed a pattern. Certain valleys appeared on maps produced in different regions, by different cultures, separated by hundreds of miles, and yet the descriptions were eerily similar. Same approximate latitude, same configuration of peaks, same rivers. He began to suspect that these were not independent mythologies, but fragmentary memories of a real location, preserved across cultures that had once been connected and then isolated by shifting political boundaries. What if, Roerich wondered, the gaps in the official maps were not errors, but recognitions? What if the blank spaces were the most accurate parts, honest admissions, that some territories existed outside the logic of surveying, accessible only by those who knew how to read the deeper map? By the mid-20th century, satellite imagery and aerial photography had filled in most of the Himalayan blank spaces. The age of the unsurveyed white space seemed over. And yet, stories persist. Trekkers report stumbling upon valleys not shown on their maps. Pilots flying over the Himalayas occasionally note features lakes, settlements, geometric formations that appear on no chart. These reports are usually dismissed as GPS errors, misidentifications, or simply fabrications. But they continue. Perhaps the cartographer's mirage was never about what the maps showed, but about what they couldn't show. Perhaps Shangri-La exists in the space between the map's claim to completeness and the territory as infinite complexity. Perhaps it is always just beyond the edge of the latest survey, waiting in the place where certainty ends and wonder begins. The map is not the territory, and the territory, sometimes, protects its secrets by making the map a beautiful lie. Geography can create miracles. At extreme altitude, where most life struggles to survive, certain valleys exist in a state of meteorological grace. They are accidents of topography folds in the earth, where mountain ranges converge in configurations that trap warmth, block harsh winds, and create microclimates disconnected from the surrounding environment. In these places, while blizzards rage a few miles away, the air remains temperate, streams run unfrozen, and vegetation thrives. Scientists call them rain-shadow valleys, or thermal refugia. The mechanism is straightforward. A valley oriented north-south, surrounded by peaks that block prevailing winds, can exist 10 or even 20 degrees warmer than the surrounding plateau. If such a valley also sits at a lower elevation relative to nearby peaks, the compression of descending air can further warm it. At a south-facing slope to maximize sunlight, and the effect intensifies. The result is an ecological island, a pocket of biodiversity and habitability in an otherwise harsh landscape. The Khumbu Valley in Nepal, home to the Sherpa people and gateway to Everest, is one such place. Despite sitting at elevations where oxygen is scarce, the valley supports terraced agriculture, forests of rhododendron and pine, and year-round settlement. Travelers arriving from the windswept Tibetan Plateau describe it as stepping into a hidden garden. The Hunza Valley in northern Pakistan is another example, even more dramatic. Surrounded by some of the highest peaks on Earth, Rakaposhi, Ultersar, Hunza Peak, the valley floor sits at a relatively modest 7,000 feet. The Hunza River, fed by glaciers, provides irrigation. The surrounding mountains shelter the valley from the worst of the monsoon and winter storms. The result is a place where apricots, walnuts, and grapes grow at altitudes that should be barren. Early European visitors described it in terms that echo descriptions of Shangri-La, a place of improbable fertility, serene beauty, and long-lived inhabitants. Could such a place, if sufficiently isolated, remain unknown for centuries? The science suggests yes. The Himalayas are vast, spanning over 1,500 miles and containing hundreds of significant valleys. Many regions remain sparsely populated and difficult to access. A valley tucked into a side range, accessible only by a single high pass that is snow-blocked most of the year, might see visitors once in a generation, if that. To the outside world, it might exist only as rumor. Consider the Zanskar Valley in India, which was essentially cut off from the outside world until the 1970s. For centuries, the only route in was the Chadar Treka winter path along a frozen river, usable only when the ice was thick enough to walk on, but not so thick that it broke into impassable chunks. The valley developed its own dialect, its own customs, its own rhythm of life. When roads finally connected it to the broader world, anthropologists were astonished at how much of traditional Tibetan culture had been preserved there, simply because isolation had shielded it from the upheavals of the 20th century. Now imagine a valley even more isolated. No winter ice path, no line of sight to neighboring settlements. Accessible only to those who knew the route, and perhaps not accessible to outsiders at all, by design or by protective geography. Such a valley could harbor not just a unique microclimate, but a unique culture, evolving in its own direction, untouched by the currents of history that swept over the rest of the world. There is tantalizing evidence that such places exist or existed. In 1993, Chinese scientists exploring a remote region of the Yarlung Songkou Gorge discovered valleys with subtropical vegetation at elevations where such vegetation should be impossible. Ferns, orchids, species typically found thousands of feet lower. The gorge, one of the deepest in the world, creates such extreme variations in climate over short distances that ecosystems stratify in ways found almost nowhere else on Earth. The region is so difficult to access that large portions remain unexplored even now. Could one of these hidden climate pockets be Shangri-La? Not in the sense of a magical or supernatural place, but in the sense of a valley where nature itself has created conditions for a kind of paradise. A place temperate when the surroundings are harsh, fertile when the surroundings are barren, calm when the surroundings are violent. A place where the struggle for survival is eased just enough that life can be devoted to other things: contemplation, art, the refinement of wisdom. The science cannot prove Shangri-La exists, but it proves that could exist. And in the space between possibility and proof, the legend thrives. Among the legends that cling to the Himalayas, few are as persistent as the tales of extraordinary longevity. Visitors to remote valleys have, for generations, returned with accounts of villagers claiming ages that strain credulity, men and women who say they remember events from a century and a half past, whose faces are deeply lined, but whose eyes remain sharp, who still tend fields and flocks at ages when most of the world is long buried. The Hunza people became internationally famous for such claims. In the early 20th century, British officers stationed near the Hunza Valley began to notice something curious. The locals seemed remarkably healthy and long-lived. Claims of lifespans extending past 120 years were common. One man, Syed Abdul Mahmud, reportedly lived to 160. These were not scientific verifiable records. No birth certificates existed in the valley until the mid-20th century, but the consistency of the accounts and the apparent vitality of the elderly impressed observers. Medical researchers arrived to investigate. They found a population with low rates of heart disease, cancer, and degenerative illness. Diets were simple: whole grains, apricots, walnuts, occasional meat, water from glacier streams. Physical activity was constant. The mountainous terrain made sedentary life impossible. Social structures emphasized community and respect for elders, reducing stress and isolation. Some researchers suggested that the combination of diet, exercise, clean environment, and social cohesion created conditions for unusual health and longevity. Skeptics pointed out the obvious problem. Without written records, the age claims were unverifiable. Many traditional cultures measure age differently, counting seasons or significant events rather than years. What Westerners interpreted as claims of extreme age might simply be expressions of esteem calling someone very old as a way of honoring their wisdom, rather than making a literal biological statement. And yet, the pattern repeats across different regions. In Bhutan, in Ladakh, in isolated pockets of Tibet and Nepal, similar stories emerge. Villages where the elderly remain active and alert, well beyond the global average. Monasteries where monks in their 90s still participate fully in rituals and teachings. Hermits living in caves at impossible altitudes, sustained by practices that seem to defy physiological norms. The Tibetan Buddhist tradition includes specific practices aimed at extending life, not for the sake of clinging to existence, but to provide more time for spiritual development. These practices, part of the Tantra's asterisk, involve meditation, breath control, herbal medicine, and rituals designed to balance the body's energies. The goal is not immortality, but optimization, making the most of the time one has by maintaining health and clarity as long as possible. Some of these practices have been studied scientifically. Tummo meditation, for example, which involves generating internal heat, has been shown to alter metabolism and immune response in measurable ways. Monks practicing Tummo can raise their skin temperature significantly, remain comfortable in conditions that would cause hypothermia in untrained individuals, and show unusual resilience to illness. If meditation can alter body temperature, what else might it affect? Could consistent practice, sustained over decades, slow aging? Modern genetics offers another angle. High-altitude populations, including Tibetans and Sherpas, have evolved specific adaptations to hypoxia-low oxygen levels. Certain gene variants help them maintain oxygen efficiency, reduce oxidative stress, and avoid the cellular damage that contributes to aging. It's not that they age more slowly in a dramatic sense, but that they avoid some of the cumulative damage that accelerates aging in lowland populations. Combined with lifestyle factors, diet, activity, reduced exposure to pollution and industrial toxins, the result might be a population that appears younger, healthier, and longer lived than those in other regions. But there is also the psychological dimension. In a culture where time is not measured obsessively, where birthdays are not tracked, where age is marked by wisdom rather than years, the subjective experience of aging might differ. The stress of dreading aging, of fearing obsolescence, of counting down remaining years, that stress itself accelerates decline. A culture that does not fear aging might, paradoxically, age more gracefully. So did the people of Shangri-La never age? Probably not in the literal sense of biological immortality. But might they have lived longer, healthier lives than their counterparts elsewhere? The evidence, fragmentary and anecdotal as it is, suggests they might have. And in a world obsessed with anti-aging, with preserving youth, with conquering death, the legend of people who never aged speaks to a deeper longing, not for eternal life, but for a life well-lived, sustained in health and peace until its natural end. Shangri-La, in this reading, is not a place where time stops, but a place where time moves as it should, neither rushed nor resented, simply lived. What if the secret of Shangri-La is not in the geography, but in the mind? Modern neuroscience and psychology have begun to map what ancient traditions described in metaphor, that states of consciousness can be cultivated, that the mind can be trained to alter the body's responses, and that sustained practice can create lasting changes in both brain structure and gene expression. The eternal peace of Shangri-La, in other words, might not be a place you find, but a state you achieve. Studies of long-term meditation practitioners show remarkable neurological changes. The prefrontal cortex associated with executive function and emotional regulation becomes thicker. The amygdala, the brain's fear and stress center, becomes less reactive. The default mode network, responsible for self-referential thinking and mind-wandering, shows reduced activity, correlating with reported feelings of reduced anxiety and increased present-moment awareness. These are not trivial changes. Brain scans of Tibetan monks with decades of meditation experience show patterns of gamma-wave activity associated with heightened awareness and cognitive processing that are off the charts compared to control subjects. Some of these monks report subjective states that sound like descriptions of Shangri-La, a sense of timelessness, profound peace, dissolution of the boundary between self and environment. They do not need to travel to a hidden valley. They carry it within them. Epigenetics adds another layer. The field studies how behavior and environment can activate or suppress genes without altering the DNA sequence itself. Chronic stress, for example, activates gene pathways associated with inflammation, immune suppression, and accelerated aging. Conversely, practices like meditation, regular physical activity, and strong social bonds activate pathways associated with cellular repair, reduced inflammation, and longevity. A study published in 2013 found that after an intensive meditation retreat, participants showed changes in the expression of genes related to immune function and stress response. The genetic potential was always there. The retreat simply activated it. Extrapolate this to a lifetime of practice in a supportive community, and the cumulative effects could be profound. Traditional Tibetan medicine operates on similar principles, though framed in different language. The system describes health as a balance of three subtle energies: wind, bile, and phlegm, which correspond roughly to nervous system activity, metabolic processes, and fluid regulation. Imbalances manifest as illness. Treatments include diet, herbal medicine, meditation, and ritual practices designed to restore equilibrium. The goal is not just to cure symptoms, but to address the underlying patterns of imbalance. When Western doctors examined practitioners of Tibetan medicine in the mid-20th century, they were often surprised by the sophistication of diagnostic techniques and the effectiveness of certain treatments. Herbal compounds used for centuries in Tibet were later found to contain active ingredients that modern pharmacology confirmed as therapeutic. The mysterious longevity of Himalayan peoples might owe as much to this accumulated medical wisdom as to diet and environment. But perhaps most important is the social dimension. Research on the world of blue zones, regions where people live significantly longer than average, identifies common factors: plant-based diets, regular moderate physical activity, strong family bonds, active social lives, and a sense of purpose. These factors are not exotic. They are accessible to anyone. What makes them rare is consistency. Maintaining them over a lifetime requires a culture that supports them. Shangri-La, described in *Lost Horizon* in Buddhist texts, is precisely such a culture. A community organized around nonviolence, mutual support, contemplative practice, and meaningful work. A place where social status does not depend on wealth accumulation or competition, where elders are respected, where time is not commodified, where the pace of life aligns with biological and psychological needs rather than fighting them. Could such a place exist today? Bhutan's policy of measuring gross national happiness rather than gross domestic product is an attempt to institutionalize these values. The results are mixed. Modern pressures and inequalities have crept in, but the experiment suggests that a society organized around well-being rather than growth is possible, if challenging. And so the DNA of serenity is both literal and metaphorical. Literal in that certain practices and environments activate gene pathways supporting health and longevity. Metaphorical in that serenity is encoded not in our genes, but in our cultures, our practices, our choices. Shangri-La is not a place we discover, but a way of living we create. The valley hidden beyond the mountains may be inaccessible, but the state it represents peace, health, timelessness, can be cultivated wherever we are. The map to Shangri-La, it turns out, is not drawn on paper, but written in our habits, our relationships, our daily practices. The journey is not across mountains, but inward. And that, perhaps, is the most enduring wisdom the legend offers. That the paradise we seek is not elsewhere, but here, if we can learn to see it. Long before Western explorers set out to map the Himalayas, Tibetan lamas navigated them using a different kind of cartography. These were not maps of terrain, but maps of destiny texts, describing *Bayul*, hidden lands that would reveal themselves in times of need. These valleys were not merely geographical features, but spiritual sanctuaries, woven into the fabric of the cosmos, protected by invisible forces and accessible only to those whose karma aligned with their discovery. The concept of Bayul emerges from the teachings of Padmasambhava, the 8th century Indian master who brought Buddhism to Tibet. According to tradition, he foresaw the future troubles Tibet would face: invasions, persecutions, the suppression of the Dharma. To preserve Buddhist teachings and provide refuge for practitioners, he identified and consecrated certain valleys throughout the Himalayas, then concealed them behind layers of protection, geographical remoteness, optical illusions, spiritual guardians, and energetic seals. These valleys were not hidden from everyone. Local populations often lived within them, unaware of the special properties their home possessed. Rather, they were hidden from those who would misuse them. The Bayul would remain invisible to invaders, skeptics, and the spiritually unprepared. Only when the world descended into sufficient chaos, and only to seekers of genuine purity, would the valleys open. Instructions for finding Bayul were encoded in *TERM, hidden teachings revealed to specific individuals, called *Tertans*, at predestined times. These texts, written in Dakini script, a symbolic encoded language, described routes, obstacles, signs, and practices required to gain entry. A Tertan might receive a vision of a hidden valley, discover a text describing its location, and then lead a group of followers on a pilgrimage to find it. One of the most famous Bayul is Pimako, located in the Yarlung Sangko Gorge, where the river bends around the mountain Namha Barwa. The name means lotus array, and the valley is described as shaped like a lotus flower, with petals formed by converging ridges. Expeditions in the late 19th and early 20th centuries confirmed that the region exists and possesses extraordinary ecological diversity, but access remains extremely difficult. The gorge's depth, the river's violence, and the density of vegetation create natural barriers that have deterred all but the most determined explorers. Other Bayul include Kembalung, said to lie along the border of Nepal and Tibet, Bayul Dremojong, identified with parts of Sikkim, and several smaller valleys scattered throughout Bhutan and northern India. Each has its own lore, its own protective features, and its own prophesied moment of revelation. What is striking is how seriously these traditions are taken. Even in the modern era, with satellite maps and GPS, Tibetan communities continue to regard certain regions as Bayul. Pilgrimages are organized, not as tourist excursions, but as spiritual undertakings. Lamas perform rituals to request entry. Travelers prepare through meditation and purification practices. The journey is understood as both physical and spiritual, a crossing of outer mountains and inner obstacles simultaneously. And there are accounts, difficult to verify but persistent, of successful discoveries. In the 1960s, during the upheaval of the Cultural Revolution, groups of Tibetans fleeing persecution reported finding valleys that sheltered them, places where Chinese forces, pursuing closely, somehow lost the trail. In some accounts, soldiers stood at the entrance to a valley but could not see it, as if a veil obscured it from hostile eyes. These stories sound like fantasy, yet they appear repeatedly in testimonies from refugees. Anthropologists suggest a more prosaic explanation, that the Bayul are real geographical locations whose remoteness and difficulty of access create an impression of inaccessibility. The spiritual protection is actually topographical protection, steep passes, hidden trails, misleading landmarks. The veil is simply the fact that those unfamiliar with the terrain cannot navigate it, while locals initiated into the knowledge can. But this explanation, all rational, misses something. The Bayul are not just places, but practices. To seek a Bayul is to undertake a transformation. The journey itself, the physical hardship, the meditative preparation, the communal purpose changes the seeker. By the time one arrives, one is no longer the same person who set out. The valley opens not because geography shifted, but because perception did. This is the function of the sacred compass. It does not point to a location on a map, but to a state of readiness. When you are prepared, the valley appears. When you are not, it remains hidden. The compass is attuned not to magnetic north, but to spiritual alignment. Shangri-La, in this understanding, is the ultimate Bayul, the hidden valley awaiting revelation, the place that will appear when the world needs it most. It is not lost because it was never found in the conventional sense. It is waiting, protected by its own nature, for the moment and the seekers that can meet it. The sacred compass still points the way. We simply have to learn how to read it. Among the many Bayul described in Tibetan tradition, one possesses a particularly strange characteristic. It is said to open itself. Most hidden valleys require effort to find arduous journeys, the guidance of a lama, the performance of specific rituals. But this particular valley, whose name is variously given as Shi Kar Jong, or sometimes simply as the self-opening land, is prophesied to reveal itself spontaneously when the world reaches a critical threshold of darkness and suffering. No one will need to search for it. It will appear, visible to all who need refuge, as if a veil had been lifted from the landscape. The earliest references to this concept appear in Terma texts attributed to Padmasambhava. He describes a time when the barbaric forces of iron and blood will dominate the world, when teachings will be suppressed and kindness will seem extinct. In that era, the self-opening land will emerge from concealment, becoming accessible from multiple directions simultaneously. Rivers will change course to lead toward it. Clouds will part to reveal its location. Even those with no spiritual training will feel drawn to it, guided by an inexplicable intuition. Tibetan scholars have debated whether this is literal prophecy or metaphor. Interpretation suggests a physical valley hidden by some natural or supernatural mechanism, perhaps tectonic activity, or glacial shifts, or a magnetic anomaly that distorts perception, that will reverse when cosmic conditions align. The metaphorical reading suggests that the valley is a state of consciousness or a new form of community that will emerge when humanity reaches a crisis point, a collective awakening born of necessity. But there is a third possibility, rarely discussed, that the prophecy is a kind of self-fulfilling wisdom. By describing a refuge that will appear in times of desperate need, the teaching itself creates resilience. Those who believe in the self-opening land do not despair, even when circumstances seem hopeless. They maintain hope, preserve kindness, and continue practices that keep wisdom alive. And by doing so, they become the refuge they are waiting for. The valley opens not in geography, but in their actions. They embody Shangri-La. There is a documented case that hints at this dynamic. During the Tibetan diaspora, following the Chinese occupation in the 1950s, tens of thousands of refugees fled across the Himalayas into India and Nepal. The journey was catastrophic. Families separated, elders and children dying from cold and starvation, monasteries' entire populations trekking through winter passes. By all accounts, it should have been the end of Tibetan Buddhism. Instead, the diaspora preserved it. Refugee communities, settling in places like Dharamshala, recreated monasteries, schools, and cultural institutions. Teachings that had been confined to specific regions of Tibet were now shared across the diaspora, cross-pollinating traditions that had been isolated for centuries. The exile, paradoxically, revitalized the culture. Observers described Dharamshala as a new Shangri-La, not because it was peaceful, it was poor and crowded, but because it became a place where Tibetan culture was intensely alive and accessible to the world. Did the self-opening land reveal itself? In a sense, yes. Not as a hidden valley in Tibet, but as a network of communities around the world, sustained by refugees who carried their culture in memory and practice. The valley opened by dispersing, by becoming not a single location, but a diaspora held together by shared values and determination. The prophecy, then, is not about geography, but about resilience. It says, when the world becomes unbearable, refuge will appear. Not because a magical valley will materialize, but because humans, pushed to the brink, will create sanctuaries wherever they land. The self-opening land is every place where kindness is practiced, where wisdom is preserved, where community is built in the face of fragmentation. This is a strange and powerful odd fact, that the valley which opens itself is not out there in the mountains, but within us. It appears not when we find it, but when we become it. And in that sense, it has opened countless times, in countless places, wherever people have decided that peace and compassion are worth protecting, no matter the cost. The valley is always opening. We simply have to recognize it. In Tibetan cosmology, geography is never only geography. Mountains are the bodies of gods, lakes are the eyes of dakinis, rivers are the veins of dragons. The physical landscape is a manifestation of subtle energies and divine presences. To travel through the Himalayas is to navigate a sacred topography where every peak and valley has meaning beyond its coordinates. This understanding shapes how places are chosen and named. The great monasteries were not built arbitrarily, but sited according to geomantic principles, assessing the flow of energy through land and sky. A monastery on a ridge is not simply taking advantage of views or defense. It is positioned to align with celestial forces, the balanced terrestrial energies, to serve as a conduit between earth and heaven. Mount Kailash, the most sacred peak in the Himalayas, exemplifies this fusion. For Buddhists, it is the earthly form of Mount Meru, the axis mundi around which the cosmos revolves. For Hindus, it is the abode of Shiva. For Bon practitioners, it is the soul of ancient tradition. 4 major rivers, the Indus, Sutlej, Brahmaputra, and Karnali, flow from its vicinity, making it a hydrological nexus as well as a spiritual one. Pilgrims circumambulate the mountain, completing the Kora, which is both a physical journey of about 30 miles and a symbolic traversal of death, transformation, and rebirth. The mountain's perfect pyramidal shape, its perennially snow-covered slopes, its inaccessibility, no one has ever summited it, and attempts are forbidden. All contribute to its numinous quality. It is a place where earth touches sky, where the boundary between the physical and the metaphysical dissolves. To be in its presence is to feel the thinness of the veil between worlds. Other peaks have similar significance. Machapucher in Nepal, the Fish-Tail Mountain, is considered the dwelling place of Shiva and is forbidden to climbers. Kumbila, sacred to the Sherpa, is protected from commercial mountaineering. These mountains are not obstacles to conquer, but presences to respect. The Western obsession with summiting, with planting flags, and claiming victories, fundamentally at odds with this cosmology. The mountains are not there to be defeated. They are there to be revered. This attitude extends to valleys. A valley shaped like a lotus, or resembling a mandala when viewed from above, is considered especially auspicious. Such places are natural shrines, locations where the geometry of the land itself facilitates meditation and realization. The hidden valleys, the Bayul, are often identified by such features, not only their inaccessibility, but their sacred shape. Shangri-La, as described in both fiction and legend, possesses these qualities. It is a valley in the shape of perfection, surrounded by peaks that mirror celestial configurations. The geography itself is mandala-like, circular and centered, a reflection of cosmic order. To enter it is to enter a space that is simultaneously physical and archetypal. But there is also an astronomical dimension. Certain Tibetan monasteries are aligned with specific stars and constellations. The layout of temples, the orientation of stupas, the timing of rituals, all are coordinated with celestial cycles. The Himalayas, stretching east to west, serve as a natural observatory, their peaks marking the rising and setting of significant stars. In this framework, Shangri-La might not be a valley that exists continuously, but one that appears when earth and sky align in specific ways. Perhaps it is accessible only during certain astronomical conjunctions, when the position of stars, the phase of the moon, and the season converge to open a window in time and space. This would explain why expeditions fail to find it. They arrive at the wrong moment when the alignment is closed. This idea sounds esoteric, even fantastical. But consider Stonehenge, the pyramids of Egypt, Angkor Wat, and countless other ancient structures were built with precise astronomical alignments. The ancients understood that time and space are interconnected, that celestial movements influence terrestrial energies. If they could encode that understanding in stone, might they not also encode it in geography, identifying places where natural features align with cosmic patterns? Shangri-La, in this reading, is a place between earth and sky, not metaphorically, but literally. A valley where the geometry of land mirrors the geometry of heaven, where energies converge in ways that create unusual effects. Enhanced longevity, heightened awareness, a sense of being outside normal time. The valley does not defy physics. It harnesses it, utilizing principles we are only beginning to understand: relationships between geomagnetic fields, solar radiation, atmospheric conditions, and human physiology. The ancients mapped these relationships through centuries of observation and experimentation. The maps they left are not written in latitude and longitude, but in symbolism, ritual, and story. Shangri-La is marked on that map, not as a location, but as a convergence, a place where earth meets sky, where the temporal meets the eternal, where the human and the divine intersect. To find it, one must learn to read the sky as well as the land, to recognize that the journey to Shangri-La is not horizontal but vertical, not a crossing of distance, but an ascent of consciousness, a rising toward the place where earth and heaven touch. By the mid-20th century, the isolation that had protected the Himalayan valleys for centuries began to crumble. The forces of modernity, roads, telecommunications, tourism, political integration penetrated regions that had existed for generations on their own terms. The hidden began to be revealed, and in the revealing, something was lost. The process was uneven and gradual. Roads reached Ladakh in the 1960s, transforming a weeks-long trek into a 2-day drive. Airports opened in Leh, Bhutan, and Kathmandu, connecting remote highlands to global networks. Telecommunications towers sprouted on ridges, bringing television and internet to villages that had never seen written language. Young people began to leave, drawn by opportunities in Indian and Nepali cities, leaving monasteries and fields understaffed. Tourism played an ambivalent role. On one hand, it brought revenue to impoverished regions, funding schools and hospitals. On the other, it commodified culture. Monasteries that had been centers of living practice became attractions, their rituals performed on schedule for visitors with cameras. Traditional dress, once worn daily, became costume for photo opportunities. The very isolation and authenticity that made these places appealing began to erode under the weight of attention. The Chinese occupation of Tibet in the 1950s was the most dramatic rupture. Thousands of monasteries were destroyed or repurposed. Monks were forced to disrobe, texts were burned, and religious practice was suppressed. The Cultural Revolution intensified the devastation. By the 1980s, Tibetan Buddhism in Tibet had been nearly extinguished. What survived did so in exile or in the most remote corners, places too insignificant to bother with. The Dalai Lama's flight to India in 1959 marked the symbolic end of the Hidden Kingdom. Tibet, which had maintained a policy of isolation for centuries, was now fully integrated into China, its borders sealed, its secrets extracted. The roof of the world was no longer inaccessible. It was occupied, surveyed, and controlled. But the fall was not only political, it was also environmental. Climate change began to manifest in the Himalayas as dramatically as anywhere on Earth. Glaciers, which had carved and fed the valleys for millennia, began to retreat. Rivers that had flowed reliably became unpredictable, flooding in summer and drying in winter. Landslides increased as permafrost melted. The delicate microclimates that had made certain valleys paradisiacal began to destabilize. The hidden valleys, the Bayul, were no longer so hidden. Satellite imagery mapped every ridge and ravine. Google Earth allowed anyone to explore the Himalayas from their living room. The blank spaces on the map filled in, and with them, the space for mystery contracted. And yet, something resisted. Even as the physical isolation ended, the spiritual dimension persisted. Tibetan Buddhism adapted, finding new forms in the diaspora. Teachings that had been secret were published, translated, disseminated globally. The wisdom of the hidden valleys became accessible to anyone with an internet connection. In a paradoxical way, the fall of the hidden kingdoms led to the rise of a global Sangha, a community of practitioners connected not by geography, but by shared commitment. Some monasteries resisted modernization deliberately. In Bhutan, the government limited tourist visas and required that visitors pay significant daily fees, using policy to protect culture. Traditional architecture is mandated, and the measurement of gross national happiness over GDP represents an attempt to preserve values that elsewhere were abandoned in the rush toward development. In other regions, remote valleys remain difficult to access despite technological advances. The Yarlung Tsangpo Gorge, parts of the Karakoram, sections of the Nepalese highlands, these areas are technically mappable but practically inaccessible. Their terrain so rugged that roads and airports cannot be built economically. They remain hidden, not by secrecy, but by sheer difficulty. So the fall of the hidden kingdoms is not complete. What fell was the illusion that isolation could be maintained indefinitely, that modernity could be kept at bay by mountains and distance. What persists is the values those kingdoms represented: peace, wisdom, simplicity, reverence for the sacred. These values do not require geographical isolation. They require commitment. Shangri-La, in this sense, did not fall. It transformed. It ceased to be a place one could flee to and became instead a set of principles one must consciously cultivate. The valley hidden beyond the mountains became the practice hidden within the heart. The journey to Shangri-La became the work of creating it wherever one lives. The hidden kingdoms fell so that the hidden wisdom could rise, dispersed across the world, accessible to all who seek it. The eternal peace is no longer guarded by peaks, but by practice. And perhaps that is the way it was always meant to be. Imagine this. You have been walking for days, perhaps weeks. The trail, barely distinguishable from the scree and rock around it, climbs and descends in exhausting rhythms. Your knees ache, your lungs labor in the thin air, and the cold has settled into your bones. The landscape is monochrome gray stone, white snow, the pale sky. There is no sound but your breath and the wind. Then you crest a ridge, and the world changes. Below you, hidden until this moment by the fold of the mountains, lies a valley. It is green and possibly vividly green a color you had almost forgotten existed. Terraced fields cascade down slopes like steps for giants. A river, turquoise and clear, winds through the center. Clusters of stone houses, their roofs weighted with slate, nestle against hillsides. Smoke rises from chimneys, straight and white in the still air. The valley is sheltered on all sides by peaks, their snow-covered summits glowing in the afternoon light. You descend. The air warms as you lose elevation, and with the warmth comes scent wildflowers, juniper, something herbal and clean. The sound of water becomes audible, not just the river, but smaller streams tumbling over stones. Birds call from the willows lining the banks, species you do not recognize, their songs complex and melodic. As you approach the village, a figure emerges, a man, elderly, dressed in homespun wool. His face is deeply lined, his eyes bright. He greets you in a language you do not understand, but his gestures are clear. Welcome. He leads you along a path of smooth stones toward a cluster of buildings. Other villagers appear, curious but not alarmed. Children peer from doorways. Dogs approach to sniff, tails wagging. You are brought to a guest house, a simple structure, whitewashed walls, a wooden door. Inside, it is warmer. A fire burns in a clay hearth. There are cushions, rugs woven in geometric patterns, a low table set with tea and flatbread. The elderly man gestures for you to sit, to eat, to rest. He speaks, and though you do not understand the words, the tone is calming, reassuring. Outside, the sun descends behind the western peaks, and the valley fills with golden light. Prayer flags strung between houses flutter gently, their colors blue, white, red, green, yellow vivid against the deepening sky. From somewhere comes the sound of chanting, low and resonant human voices blending with the hum of the wind. You realize you have not checked your watch, your GPS, your phone. Time, which had been measured in miles and hours, has become elastic. You do not know how long you have been here. It does not seem to matter. The exhaustion of the journey begins to lift, replaced by a calm you have not felt in years, perhaps ever. Over the following days, or is it weeks, you begin to learn the rhythms of the valley. Villagers rise early, tend fields and animals, prepare simple meals. There is work, but it is unhurried. There is conversation, much of it silent, conducted through glances and small gestures. There is laughter, but it is soft, integrated into the day rather than erupting from it. You notice details. The way the elderly are cared for, included in every gathering, their opinions sought. The way children are taught, not in classrooms, but through participation, learning by doing alongside adults. The way disputes are resolved, not through argument, but through mediation, often involving a lama from the small monastery perched above the village. The monastery itself is ancient, its walls painted with fading murals of deities and mandalas. The monks are few, perhaps a dozen, but their presence suffuses the valley. Twice a day, morning and evening, they chant, and the sound carries on the wind, audible from every corner of the valley. The chanting is not performative. It is a practice as natural as breathing, a way of aligning with something larger. You ask, through gestures and broken phrases learned from a younger villager who knows a bit of English, about the valley's history. He shrugs, smiles. Old, he says, very old. How old? He does not know. His grandfather's grandfather was born here, and before that, the same. Always the same. You ask about the outside world. Does he know what lies beyond the mountains? He nods. Of course, some villagers leave, especially the young, drawn by curiosity or necessity. Most return. Some do not. He himself spent a year in the city. He does not say which city, and found it loud, crowded, restless. He came back. Here is better, he says simply. One evening, sitting outside as the stars emerge in a sky utterly free of light pollution, you feel something shift. It is not traumatic, not a revelation, but a quiet recognition. You are not separate from this place. The boundaries you carry between self and other, between past and future, between what is and what should be, have softened. You are here, fully here, and it is enough. This is Shangri-La. Not because the valley is perfect, there is hardship here, illness, loss, but because it has found a way to hold those difficulties without being consumed by them. The peace is not the absence of struggle, but the presence of acceptance, of community, of continuity. Eventually, you must leave. The journey that brought you here must be retraced. The world you came from is still there, still waiting. But as you climb back up the trail, turning to look down at the valley one last time, you carry something with you, a memory, a scent, a sense that another way of living is possible. The mist closes in, and the valley disappears. But you know it is there. And you know, in a way you cannot quite articulate, that it will always be there, waiting for those who need it, those who can find it, those who can see through the mist. Where does a legend begin? Not in the moment of telling, but in the moments perhaps centuries earlier that are remembered, distorted, and retold until they crystallize into narrative. Scholars tracing the roots of the Shangri-La myth have discovered a complex web of sources stretching back through Sanskrit texts, Tibetan chronicles, Chinese annals, and oral traditions that may predate writing entirely. The legend is not a single thread, but a tapestry woven from many strands, each contributing a piece of the vision. One of the earliest textual references appears in the asterisk Kalachakra Tantra asterisk, which describes Shambhala in terms that blend geography and symbolism. But even the asterisk Kalachakra asterisk is not the origin. It references older teachings, now lost or preserved only in fragments. The text mentions northern lands beyond the Himalayas, places where the Dharma was strong and the people lived in harmony. Were these real kingdoms, remembered, and then mythologized? Or were they always symbolic, representing states of consciousness rather than physical locations? Chinese historians of the Tang Dynasty, 618 to 907 CE, recorded expeditions into the western regions, encountering kingdoms in the Tarim Basin and the Pamirs. Some of these accounts describe valleys of extraordinary beauty and prosperity, isolated by mountains, governed by Buddhist kings. One chronicle mentions a kingdom called Kulang, hidden among snows, where the people know neither war nor hunger. The kingdom's location is vague, and no subsequent records confirm its existence. It may have been a real place, destroyed or absorbed into larger empires. Or it may have been exaggeration, a traveler's tale amplified in retelling. The Bon tradition, Tibet's pre-Buddhist spiritual system, also speaks of hidden lands. In Bon cosmology, the world has multiple layers, some physical and some subtle. Certain valleys are described as doorways between these layers, places where the boundary is thin and passage is possible for those with the right knowledge. These valleys are not hidden by geography alone, but by the fact that most people cannot perceive them. They exist at a frequency, so to speak, that requires tuning to detect. Sanskrit epics like the asterisk Mahabharata asterisk describe mountain kingdoms ruled by wise sages. Places like Alakapuri, the city of Kubura, god of wealth, said to be located in the Himalayas. These are clearly mythological, yet they may preserve memories of real Himalayan kingdoms that thrived before they were forgotten. In the 19th century, Western Orientalists began compiling these scattered references, looking for patterns. They noticed that from India to Mongolia, from Persia to China, similar legends appeared. Hidden valleys, wise rulers, eternal peace, mountains that protected paradise. The details varied, but the structure was consistent. This suggested either a common psychological archetype, the universal human, longing for a utopia, or a shared memory of something real that had been forgotten. Some scholars propose a historical candidate, the Kingdom of Khotan, a Buddhist state that flourished in the Tarim Basin from roughly the 3rd century BCE to the 11th century CE. Khotan was a center of learning, a stop on the Silk Road, and a place where Indian, Chinese, and Central Asian cultures blended. Accounts describe it as prosperous, peaceful, and culturally sophisticated. It was eventually conquered and absorbed, but its memory persisted in the surrounding regions. Could legends of Shambhala and Shangri-La be echoes of Khotan, distorted and relocated over centuries of oral transmission? Another theory points to the Guj kingdom in western Tibet, which thrived from the 10th to the 17th centuries. Guj was a center of Buddhist scholarship and art, producing some of the most exquisite murals and sculptures in Tibetan history. It was remote, difficult to access, and relatively isolated from the political upheavals affecting central Tibet. Then, in the 17th century, it was abandoned, possibly due to war, possibly due to water shortages. The ruins, rediscovered in the 20th century, are hauntingly beautiful, a city of temples and palaces carved into desert cliffs. Could Guj be one of the real hidden kingdoms that inspired the myth? Archaeology cannot provide definitive answers, but it offers tantalizing possibilities. The myth of Shangri-La is not fabricated for nothing. It is built on a foundation of real places, real cultures, and real histories that have been transformed through memory and imagination into something larger than fact. The legend is archaeology's opposite, while archaeology digs down to recover the past. Legend builds up, layering meaning upon meaning until the original is barely recognizable, but infinitely more powerful. Shangri-La, in this reading, is a palimpsest. Beneath the 20th century novel lie Tibetan prophecies. Beneath those lie Buddhist cosmologies. Beneath those lie memories of real kingdoms, real valleys, real moments when humans created societies that approximated peace. And beneath all of it lies the deepest layer, the human need to believe that such a place is possible, that somewhere, somehow, we can escape the suffering we create and find rest. The archaeologists will continue to excavate. They will find more ruins, more texts, more evidence, and perhaps one day they will identify a specific location and say, "Here, this is where Shangri-La began." But by then, the myth will have moved on, settled into new geography, new stories, new hearts. Because the archaeology of a myth is never complete. The dig continues as long as humans continue to dream. Descend into the deeper legends, and a stranger geography emerges not of valleys between mountains, but of valleys asterisk within asterisk them. The hollow earth theory, popular in Western occultism in the 19th and early 20th centuries, found peculiar resonance with certain Tibetan traditions that spoke of subterranean realms, tunnels linking sacred sites, and kingdoms hidden below the surface. The name most associated with this convergence is Agartha, sometimes Agartha or Agartha, a legendary underground kingdom said to exist beneath Central Asia. The concept entered Western consciousness through the writings of French occultist Alexandre Saint-Yves d'Alvader in the 1880s and was later popularized by Polish explorer Ferdynand Alzandowski, whose 1922 book Beasts, Men, and Gods recounted tales he claimed to have heard from Mongolian lamas during his travels. According to these accounts, Agartha was a vast subterranean civilization, technologically and spiritually advanced, ruled by the king of the world, who possessed wisdom and power beyond earthly understanding. Alzandowski described Agartha as accessible through tunnels hidden in remote monasteries and caves, particularly in Tibet and Mongolia. These tunnels stretched for hundreds, even thousands of miles, connecting sacred sites across Asia. The kingdom was said to contain libraries preserving knowledge from before historical records began, technologies that had been lost to surface civilizations, and communities of enlightened beings who chose to withdraw from the surface world as it descended into violence and ignorance. Before dismissing this as pure fantasy, consider that Tibetan tradition does speak of subterranean spaces, though in different terms. Caves and tunnels have always been important in Himalayan spirituality. Hermits retreat into them for years-long meditations. Texts are hidden in them, and some are considered gateways to other realms. The idea of an underworld is not foreign. It simply means something different than the Western hollow earth. Tibetan cosmology describes multiple realms of existence, some of which are located below in a spatial sense, but are better understood as different dimensions or states of being. The Naga realms, for instance, are associated with underground and underwater spaces, inhabited by serpent deities who control water, wealth, and certain kinds of knowledge. To enter these realms requires not just physical descent, but spiritual transformation. There are also the caves of Padmasambhava and Milarepa, the great yogis, many of which are said to extend far into mountains, with inner chambers that are hidden or inaccessible. Some monks speak of meditation caves that connect to natural tunnel systems formed by ancient water flows that could theoretically allow travel underground for considerable distances. While these are not evidence of a vast underground civilization, they show that the Himalayas are indeed honeycombed with caverns, many unexplored. In the 1920s and 30s, several Western explorers, inspired by Ossendowski and others, traveled to Tibet hoping to find entrances to Agartha. Most returned empty-handed, if they returned at all. But a few reported unusual experiences. Monks who spoke cryptically of inner kingdoms, guides who led them to cave entrances, and then refused to go further, and landscapes where compasses malfunctioned and navigation became impossible. These accounts are difficult to verify, and most historians treat them as exaggerations or fabrications. But they contributed to the legend, intertwining Shangri-La, Shambhala, and Agartha into a single mythos of hidden wisdom. The Nazi regime, intriguingly, took these legends seriously enough to send expeditions to Tibet in the 1930s and 40s, ostensibly for anthropological research, but likely searching for occult knowledge and connections to Aryan origins. The expeditions found nothing to support the fantasies, but the very fact that they were undertaken shows how powerfully the myth of a hidden Tibetan realm gripped certain imaginations. Modern geology offers no support for a hollow earth or vast underground civilizations. The planet's interior is well understood molten, pressurized, inhospitable to life as we know it. But the Himalayas do contain extensive cave systems, some of which remain unmapped. Could there be hidden valleys accessible only through tunnels? Geologically, it's possible. Practically, it seems unlikely such valleys would need water sources, light, arable land, all of which would be difficult to sustain entirely underground. So what are we to make of Agartha and the Tibetan hollow earth? Most likely, they are Western projections onto Eastern traditions, misunderstandings amplified by language barriers and the allure of the exotic. The inner kingdom is probably an inner state, the underground realm, a metaphor for the subconscious or the subtle body. The tunnels are pathways of energy or consciousness, not physical passageways. And yet, metaphor is not merely unreal. The idea of a hidden kingdom beneath the surface, preserving wisdom while the surface world rages, that is a powerful image. It speaks to the sense that what is most valuable is often hidden, protected from those who would misuse it, accessible only to those who seek with genuine intent. Shangri-La, in this esoteric reading, is not a valley on the surface or a city underground, but a state of being accessible through inner work. The entrance is meditation, the tunnel is the path of practice, and the kingdom is the realization that enlightenment has always been within, hidden beneath the surface of ordinary consciousness. The geography is spiritual, the map is symbolic, and the journey is vertical, not up the mountains or down into the earth, but inward toward the place where the eternal dwells. In 1924, a British climber named Howard Somerville, part of an Everest expedition, recorded a peculiar incident in his journal. While descending from high altitude, exhausted and delayed by weather, his team became lost in a snowstorm. They stumbled off course, ending up in an area not on their maps. As the storm cleared at dawn, they found themselves near a small monastery perched on a ridge, smoke rising from its chimney, Desperate for shelter and warm food, they approached. The monastery was built in traditional style stone walls, wooden beams, colorful murals visible through open doors. They knocked. No answer. They called out. Silence. Finally, they entered. The interior was warm. A fire burned in the hearth. On a low table sat bowls of samba, roasted barley flour, and butter tea, still steaming. Prayer wheels lined the walls, and the scent of incense hung in the air. But there were no monks, no one at all. The climbers searched the monastery, its temple, its cells, its kitchen. Beds were made, robes hung on pegs. A pot of stew simmered over the fire. Everything suggested recent habitation. But the inhabitants had vanished. Somerville and his team, too exhausted to investigate further, ate some of the food, rested by the fire, and then continued their descent. They marked the location as best they could, intending to return or report it to authorities. When the expedition ended and Somerville returned to India, he filed a report with the Survey of India, describing the monastery's location. A year later, a follow-up expedition attempted to find it. They reached the approximate coordinates. They searched the surrounding ridges. They found no monastery, no ruins, no foundation stones, no trace of human activity. Somerville insisted he had not imagined it. His teammates corroborated the account. The food they ate had been real. The warmth had saved them from hypothermia. But the monastery, it seemed, had disappeared. Explanations were proposed. They had been disoriented by altitude sickness and hallucinated. They had misremembered the location. The monastery was real, but had been abandoned and destroyed in the intervening year, though the timescale seemed too short for such complete erasure. Or perhaps the follow-up expedition simply failed to find it, given the vastness and complexity of the terrain. The incident might have faded into obscurity, except that similar stories emerged from other sources. In 1936, a trader traveling through eastern Tibet reported finding an entire village, 20 or 30 houses, with fires burning and food on tables, but completely deserted. He fled, convinced the place was haunted. In 1951, a Nepali guide led a group of Westerners to a monastery he had visited as a child. When they arrived, they found only rubble, which the guide insisted was impossible. The monastery had been thriving 2 decades earlier. In Tibetan tradition, these vanishing places are sometimes explained as asterisk terma, asterisk, sites locations that manifest temporarily to those who need them and withdraw from perception. Another explanation involves the bardos, the intermediate states described in the asterisk Tibetan Book of the Dead asterisk. Perhaps at extreme altitudes or in states of exhaustion, the boundary between this world and others becomes permeable, allowing glimpses of places that exist in parallel or in different times. Skeptics argue these are simply myths born from the delirium of altitude sickness, cultural misunderstandings, or poor record-keeping in regions where monasteries were sometimes abandoned due to political or environmental pressures. But the accounts share striking details: the fire still burning, the food still warm, the sudden and complete absence of inhabitants that suggests something beyond mere disorientation. Could there be a simpler explanation? Perhaps the monks, sensing the approach of strangers, and in the 1920s, Western climbers were often viewed with suspicion, deliberately hid, watching from concealed vantage points as the intruders helped themselves to food and then left. The monastery would then reappear once the strangers were gone. This would explain the intact supplies and the fire. The monks were never far, only unseen. Or perhaps, as some Tibetan lamas suggest, certain monasteries function as thresholds, places that exist at the boundary between the physical and spiritual worlds. To stumble upon them is to cross a threshold unintentionally. And when one leaves, the threshold closes and the place recedes back into hiddenness. Whatever the truth, the story of the monks who vanished has become part of the Shangri-La mythos evidence. For believers, that the hidden valleys are not merely metaphor, but real places that can appear and disappear, accessible only to those the valley chooses to reveal itself to. Somerville never returned to search for the monastery. His team reached the summit of Everest, well, nearly. They turned back just short due to weather. But in his later writings, he reflected on that morning in the vanished monastery, the taste of butter tea, the warmth of the fire, and the eerie silence. "I cannot explain it," he wrote. "I can only report what we experienced. Perhaps some places are not meant to be found twice. Perhaps Shangri-La is like that, a place that appears when needed, offers what it can, and then withdraws, leaving only memory and mystery. The Himalayas are not still. They are among the most geologically active regions on Earth, rising at a rate of roughly 5 millimeters per year, as the Indian tectonic plate continues its slow collision with the Eurasian plate. This process, ongoing for 50 million years, has thrust rock from the seabed to the roof of the world. Fossils of ancient marine creatures can be found near Everest's summit, a reminder that these peaks were once ocean floor. This tectonic activity manifests as earthquakes, landslides, and subtle shifts in the landscape. The mountains, in a real sense, breathe expanding, contracting, cracking, settling. Valleys that exist today may be filled tomorrow. Passes that are open one decade may close the next. The geography is not static, but fluid, changing on timescales both geological and human. Tibetan tradition recognizes this dynamism. Mountains are not inert objects, but living presences, spirits embodied in stone and ice. They respond to human behavior. Prayers appease them, disrespect engage them. Avalanches and rockfalls are not random, but expressions of the mountain's will. To live in the Himalayas is to live in relationship with these presences, to negotiate with forces that are ancient, powerful, and unpredictable. This animistic view, often dismissed as superstition, actually aligns with contemporary ecological understanding. Mountains are indeed alive, not in the sense of possessing consciousness as we define it, but as complex systems where geology, hydrology, climate, and biology interact in ways that are dynamic, responsive, and emergent. To treat them as dead matter is to misunderstand them fundamentally. The phenomenon of mountain breathing can be observed in glacial cycles. Glaciers advance and retreat in response to temperature shifts, expanding in cooler periods and receding in warmer ones. This process alters river flows, carves new valleys, and exposes or conceals terrain. A valley hidden beneath ice for centuries might suddenly be revealed as the glacier retreats. Conversely, a valley accessible for generations might be buried as ice advances. Could this explain the appearance and disappearance of hidden valleys? A bayou might be accessible during a warm period when glaciers have retreated, then become inaccessible when they advance again. To people living on human timescales, this would seem like the valley opening and closing mysteriously. But to the mountain, it is simply the rhythm of breath inhale, exhale over centuries. Seismology adds another layer. The Himalayas experience frequent earthquakes, most of them minor, some catastrophic. The 2015 Nepal earthquake, magnitude 7.8, killed thousands and altered the landscape. Visibly, temples collapsed, mountainsides slid away, and the elevation of certain areas changed measurably. In historical times, major earthquakes have rerouted rivers, created lakes, and obliterated entire villages. Ancient texts record such events, sometimes interpreting them as divine interventions, a mountain god punishing wrongdoers or opening a valley to the righteous. But the mechanism is geological. Earthquakes can reshape the land dramatically and suddenly. A hidden valley might be created in an instant. A landslide dams a river, forming a lake. A glacier collapses, revealing a previously barrier. A ridge fractures, creating a new pass. Or conversely, a valley might be destroyed, buried under rockfall, flooded, or rendered inaccessible. The sheer pulse of the mountains, then, is both literal and metaphorical. Literal in the seismic waves that travel through rock, the glacial advance and retreat, the rise and fall of the peaks themselves. Metaphorical in the sense that the mountains embody a life force, a presence that is indifferent to human concerns, but shapes human destinies nonetheless. Shangri-La, in this geological reading, might not be a single location, but a type of location, a valley that exists in a particular state of balance, where tectonic forces, climate, and geography converge to create extraordinary conditions. Such a valley might last for decades or centuries, but it is not eternal. Eventually, the mountain breathes differently, and the valley changes. The paradise is impermanent, as all things are. But because the mountains continue to shift and breathe, new Shangri-Las might arise even as old ones vanish. The hidden valley is not a fixed point on a map, but a recurring pattern, a state that certain places enter and eventually leave. To search for Shangri-La is to search for a valley in that state, task complicated by the fact that the state itself is transient. This perspective offers a reconciliation between belief and skepticism. Yes, hidden valleys of extraordinary beauty and habitability exist. Yes, they can be discovered and for a time inhabited. But no, they are not eternal refuges immune to change. They are gifts from the mountains, offered temporarily, to be cherished while they last and released when they pass. The pulse of the mountains continues. New valleys open. Old valleys close. And somewhere, always the next Shangri-La waits to be born from the shifting stone and ice. A paradise emerging from the earth's slow dance. A sanctuary carved by the breath of giants. Look up from the mountain valleys, and another map reveals itself, one written not in stone but in light. The night sky above the Himalayas, unpolluted and crystalline at altitude, has been a source of wonder and guidance for millennia. Tibetan Buddhism, like many ancient traditions, intertwines terrestrial geography with celestial observation, recognizing patterns in the heavens that mirror patterns on earth. The Kala Chakra teachings, which describe Shambhala, are also a system of astronomy and astrology. Kala Chakra translates as Wheel of Time, and the teachings encompass cycles of planets, stars, and cosmic ages. The texts describe the movement of celestial bodies with surprising precision, suggesting observations refined over centuries. Shambhala, in this framework, is not only a physical location, but also an alignment, a moment when certain celestial conditions coincide with terrestrial readiness. Certain peaks and monasteries in Tibet and Nepal are aligned with specific stars and constellations. The placement of stupas, the orientation of temples, and the timing of festivals often correspond to solar and lunar cycles, equinoxes, solstices, and the rising of particular stars. This is not merely symbolic, but practical astronomy provided calendars for agriculture and navigation, and it was deeply integrated into spiritual practice. Draco, the dragon constellation, holds particular significance in Tibetan cosmology. It contains Thuban, which was the pole star around 2800 BCE, and its serpentine shape resonates with Naga symbolism serpents who guard treasures and waterways. In some interpretations, the alignment of certain valleys with Draco at specific times of year marks them as Bayul, hidden lands connected to dragon energy. Cassiopeia, visible year-round from high latitudes, forms a distinctive W shape and is associated in various cultures with queens and divine feminine energy. In Tibetan symbolism, it connects to Dakini's female embodiments of wisdom. Valleys considered especially auspicious for spiritual practice are sometimes described as lying beneath Cassiopeia, or Cassiopeia's light touches Earth at solstice. Orion, one of the most prominent constellations, appears in myths worldwide. In Tibetan tradition, its belt stars are sometimes associated with the three jewels of Buddhism, the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. The constellation rises in winter and sets in summer, and its cycle has been used to time migrations, plantings, and pilgrimage seasons. Some scholars suggest that Shambhala's location, described cryptically in texts, might be encoded as an alignment with Orion Valley, where the constellation appears directly overhead at a specific date. This raises an intriguing possibility. What if Shangri-La is not a fixed geographical location, but a conjunction, a place that becomes Shangri-La only when certain celestial and terrestrial conditions align? A valley might be ordinary most of the time, but transform into a bayul during a rare astronomical event, a solstice, an eclipse, a planetary alignment. Access would depend not only on knowing the location, but also on arriving at the correct moment. Such a system would explain why expeditions fail to find hidden valleys. They arrive at the wrong time. The valley is there, but the door is closed, the alignment inactive. Only those with knowledge of the astronomical keys and the patience to wait for the right moment could enter. This is not as far-fetched as it sounds. Ancient cultures worldwide built structures aligned with astronomical events: Stonehenge, the pyramids, Angkor Wat, Chaco Canyon. These were not mere monuments, but functional instruments, marking times when the veil between worlds was thought to thin, when energies were conducive to rituals, when human efforts aligned with cosmic forces. If the ancients could encode such knowledge in stone, they could also encode it in geography. A hidden valley might be identified not by its latitude and longitude alone, but by its relationship to the stars. Place where on a specific date, the sunrise illuminates a particular cave entrance, or where a mountain's shadow points to a hidden pass, or where a specific constellation's reflection appears in a sacred lake. Shangri-La, in this astronomical framework, is a sacred geography activated by sacred time. The valley exists always, but it becomes Shangri-La, becomes a place of power, transformation, and access to other dimensions only when the stars are right. Modern researchers have begun to notice these alignments. Certain monasteries in Ladakh and Tibet are positioned such that, on winter solstice, the sunrise aligns perfectly with their main temple's central corridors, illuminating inner sanctums. Others align with midsummer sunsets or the rising of particular stars. These are not accidents, but intentional designs, suggesting that the builders possessed sophisticated astronomical knowledge and considered celestial alignments essential to the sacred function of the sites. If we map the Himalayas, not just geographically, but astronomically, noting which peaks align with which stars, which valleys are illuminated, during which celestial events patterns might emerge. Certain locations might reveal themselves as nodes in a larger system, a network of sacred sites connected not by roads, but by lines of sight to the heavens. Shangri-La, then, might be the central node, the place where all these alignments converge, where the geometry of the earth and the geometry of the heavens intersect most perfectly. To find it, one would need to be not only an explorer, but also an astronomer, not only a navigator of mountains, but also a reader of stars. The map to Shangri-La is not drawn on parchment, but projected nightly onto the sky, written in the slow wheeling of constellations, the phases of the moon, the dance of planets. Those who can read that map and who arrive when the stars align might find the valley open before them. A paradise revealed not by accident, but by alignment, a moment when heaven and earth touch and the door to eternity swings wide. After all the searches, the theories, the myths, and the history, a pattern emerges. Shangri-La is not one thing but many. It is a Tibetan prophecy and a British novel. It is a microclimate sheltered by peaks and a state of consciousness cultivated through practice. It is a hidden valley and a metaphor for peace. It is geography and cosmology, history and hope. Perhaps the most useful way to understand Shangri-La is not as a specific location, but as a potential pattern that emerges under certain conditions. When geography, climate, culture, and intention align, a place becomes Shangri-La. It offers refuge from the world's chaos, sustains life without excessive struggle, and creates space for wisdom to flourish. Such places have existed throughout history. Some have been documented, others remain hidden, still others have vanished. The Hunza Valley in Pakistan, before modernization, resembled Shangri-La. Its isolation, its microclimate, its social structures all created conditions where life could be lived differently than in the lowlands. The villagers did not know they were living in a Shangri-La. They were simply living. But to outsiders, the valley seemed magical, a place where the rules of the ordinary world did not apply. The monasteries of Bhutan, perched on cliffs and carved into mountainsides, preserve traditions that have vanished elsewhere. They are not frozen in time. They adapt, they change, but they do so at their own pace, buffered by geography and policy from the relentless forces of globalization. To visit them is to step into a different temporal stream, where centuries coexist and the modern world feels distant. The refugee communities established by Tibetans in exile, particularly Dharamshala, created a kind of portable Shangri-La, a cultural island sustained not by mountains, but by commitment. Despite poverty, despite displacement, despite the loss of their homeland, they rebuilt monasteries, re-established teaching lineages, and maintained practices. The valley moved. The essence remained. So Shangri-La is not fixed in space or time. It is a state that places and communities can enter. And because it is a state rather than a location, it is not dependent on remaining hidden. Even if every valley in the Himalayas were mapped and visited, the possibility of Shangri-La would remain, because the next Shangri-La might not be in the Himalayas at all. It might be a valley in the Andes, a village in Siberia, an island in the Pacific. Or it might be a community created intentionally, people coming together with shared values, building a sanctuary, not because geography provides it, but because vision creates it. The pattern is recognizable. Isolation, enough to buffer external pressures, but not so much that resources are unavailable. A temperate environment where survival does not dominate consciousness. Social structures emphasizing cooperation and respect. Spiritual or philosophical practices that provide meaning beyond material accumulation. Time organized around human rhythms rather than industrial demands. These conditions are rare, but not impossible. They have arisen before and can arise again. Shangri-La, in this understanding, is an attractor stata, configuration that certain systems tend toward when conditions are right. It is not a utopia imposed from above, but an organic emergence from below, a natural flowering of human potential when fear and scarcity recede enough to allow it. The legend of Shangri-La persists because it names this possibility. It says, there is another way. Somewhere, somehow, peace is being lived. And if it can exist once, it can exist again. The valley waits not in a specific location, but in potential, ready to manifest when conditions align, when people are ready, when the world needs it. This is why the search for Shangri-La continues, even by those who know it is a myth. The search is not really for a place, but for proof that the pattern is real, that the life we imagine gentle, wise, sustained, is achievable. Every expedition, every investigation, every theory is an act of faith in human possibility. And sometimes people find it. Not the mythical Shangri-La of eternal youth and lamasseries in the clouds, but the real thing, a place or a community where life is better, where peace is practiced, where time moves at a human pace. They find it, stay for a while, and then often leave. Because Shangri-La, as the novel understood, is not a place you possess, but a place that possesses you temporarily, a gift rather than a claim. The valley waits, patient and recurring. It has appeared before and will appear again. Not always in the same form, not always in the same location, but always recognizable to those who seek it. A refuge, a renewal, a reminder that another world is possible. And perhaps that is enough. not to find Shangri-La, but to know it exists as a possibility, to carry the pattern within, to recognize it when glimpsed, and to create it where we can. The valley waits, but we do not have to wait for the valley. We can be the valley wherever we are. The journey ends where it began, in mist and mountains, in the space between certainty and mystery. We have traveled through history and myth, through science and spirituality, through geography and consciousness. We have searched for Shangri-La in valleys and texts, in monasteries and stars. And what have we found? Not a single answer, but a chorus of answers, each true in its own way. Shangri-La is a place James Hilton invented, inspired by real valleys and real explorers. It is a Buddhist prophecy of hidden lands that will open in times of darkness. It is a microclimate created by mountain geography. It is a state of mind cultivated through meditation. It is a longing encoded in human hearts, a dream of peace made tangible. It is all of these things and none of them, or perhaps it is the space where all these meanings converge. We have learned that myths are not opposed to truth, but are a different kind of truth that works on the imagination, truth that shapes behavior, truth that endures across generations because it names something essential. Shangri-La is true, not because it can be found on a map, but because it expresses a real human need and a real human potential. We have seen that the hidden valleys, the Beul, exist, both as geographical realities and as spiritual concepts. Some can be visited, others remain inaccessible, protected by terrain or by design. The boundary between the two is not as firm as rationalism would like. Places can be hidden in plain sight, visible only to those prepared to see them. We have discovered that the wisdom attributed to Shangri-La longevity, peace, preservation of knowledge, has real-world correlates. High-altitude populations with unique genetics, traditional practices that promote health, communities organized around values other than growth and competition, these exist and can be studied. The magic of Shangri-La is often the magic of living in alignment with natural rhythms and human needs. We have explored the idea that Shangri-La is not eternal but emergent, a pattern that arises and fades, appearing when conditions allow and disappearing when they change. This makes Shangri-La more precious, not less. It is not an unchanging refuge, but a recurring possibility, a grace that the world offers intermittently to those who seek it. And we have considered that the search itself might be the point, that in seeking Shangri-La, we become the kind of people who could recognize it, that the journey transforms us, so that when we arrive, we are capable of appreciating what we have found, or that the journey never ends, and that is as it should be, because the seeking keeps us oriented toward hope, toward peace, toward the belief that the world can be better than it is. The narrator of Lost Horizon at the novel's end does not find Shangri-La again. Conway, the protagonist, is lost somewhere in the Himalayas, searching for the valley he once knew. The narrator closes the book uncertain whether Conway succeeded or perished in the attempt. The ending is unresolved, poignant, and perfect, because the point is not arrival but desire, not possession but pilgrimage. We leave the mountains now, descending from the high valleys back toward the world of roads and cities, noise and obligations. The mist closes behind us. The peaks fade into distance. But we carry something with us, a scent of juniper, the echo of chanting, the memory of stillness. We know now that Shangri-La is not elsewhere. It is a way of seeing, a way of being, a way of organizing life around what truly matters. It is in the kindness we extend, the patience we cultivate, the moments we choose presence over distraction. It is in the communities we build, the traditions we honor, the wisdom we seek and share. Shangri-La is not a destination but a direction, not a place but a practice. And so the valley remains hidden and remains found. It disappears and reappears. It exists and does not exist. It is myth and reality, past and future, geography and consciousness. It is the echo of something we have lost and the promise of something we might yet become. The mountains stand silent, holding their secrets. The rivers flow, carrying stories down to the lowlands. The sky turns, the stars wheel, the seasons cycle. And somewhere, beyond the edge of the map, the place where certainty ends and wonder begins, a valley waits. It has always waited. It will always wait. And when we are ready, when the world is ready, perhaps it will reveal itself once more. Not as a refuge from the world, but as a reminder of what the world can be when we remember to be gentle, to be wise, to live as if time itself could be redeemed. Shangri-La, the Valley of Eternal Peace. Not eternal because it never changes, but eternal because it never stops offering itself to those with the courage to seek the humility to receive and the wisdom to recognize that the paradise we search for has been within us all along. The journey ends. The story continues. The valley waits.